Zorga has been one of my favorite decks since it was originally released in D-BT10 just because of its, though actually properly using the order mechanic for after a year of really only lyrical kind of tapping into the potential of that. And it's always been such a fascinating deck for me to build and pilot because of just the reliance on the orders, the complexity of having to combine the two. It really just leads to a ton of ideas which are so fascinating to kind of craft and test. But of course, now we got the new Zorga Masques, which is super exciting because it just takes the best of both Blue Zorga and Red Zorga and mashes it into an absolute powerhouse. Definitely, in my opinion, the best Mask deck because of its innate synergies with the Mask of Hydreigon order card. And this is my list for D-BT10 and Festival Booster. So getting into the ride line, of course, I run the standard ride line, Dream Nibbling, Rancor Chain, and Black Tears Husk Dragon into Blue Zorga. Dream Nibbling can really be whichever you want it to be, but I want to use my beautiful SP and have it be thematic. Rancor Chain is great because it lets you see 2 new cards at the cost of just discarding order, and this deck runs plenty of orders that is not hard to find that. And with the Black Tears Husk Dragon, it just makes it a +2. So you draw 2 cards from deck, meaning if it's triggers, oh well, you get guard. If it's your Persona rides, awesome, you have it. And if you find orders, well, just more cards to either discard for your ride line or keep to use with Alchemagic. I do choose to use Blue Zorga because I find a bit more utility in being able to pay for Alchemagic for free, and also the Counterblast, mainly the Counterblast one to revive something can be super useful, especially into the Gandiva matchup. It lets me be a bit more aggressive in the early game and still be able to call back Shadow Cloaks to reuse their effects. Red Zorga, I definitely think does have its own merits with its ability to kind of curate your orders a bit better, but I do just value the extra ability to be able to discard units and bring them back or into that Gandiva matchup, as I said. 3 copies of the namesake of this deck are Zorga Masques with my beautiful FFR to pair with the SPs. This card is amazing. You already gain 10k when you Persona Ride and just gives another 10k to your front row when you Alchemagic. That is, well, if you Alchemagic, I say. It's a continuous effect, which is really strong, just means that your beaters become even beefier. This alone swings for 33k if you Persona Ride with Mask going second, and this deck just wants to go second. One thing I did not mention with the ride line is if going second, you actually get to see 5 new cards in a turn. Your draw for turn, 1 for Dream Nibbling, 2 from Rancor Chain, and 1 from your drive check, which means that it is actually really easy to find your pieces going second, or at least easier than it normally is, which also gives you a bit of leeway with the ratios. Zorga Mask in particular here, as you see, I'm only running 3 copies of, and as you see as I go through the rest of the deck, there are ways to search it out, there are ways to bounce it back to hand, which makes this not a necessary card to run at 4 copies, so I like to clear up the extra deck space, and 3 is just enough to still be able to find it, to be able to do the Persona Ride going on, well, our second grade 3 turn. You can do it, I actually do think it is right to do it first if you're going first in this deck to gain the extra 10k power, because if you don't, you're just swinging for just very low numbers, even if you aren't getting the Persona Ride, and this deck actually still is pretty good about even finding a second copy as well. So 3 copies feels right. Definitely want to be going into this card. This card is amazing, and also I forgot to mention its second ability. We only run the 1 Blue Zorga here, so you want to be a bit particular when you do use this effect in your matchups as well, but it's just great utility if you need to bring back, if you're up against Gandiva, maybe you want to call something from Drop Zone instead, and against other matchups you can easily loop back orders if you need them to get different order combinations or also fuel the cost of one of our orders. So phenomenal card. Another very important card is still the Roaming Prison Dragon here. This card is just, if you can get 2 in Drop Zone, it's insane. It calls itself out, so this, if you have 2 in Drop Zone, that's a +2 just off of Alchemagicking alone, and this gains 10k and +1 crit, so just huge beaters. And paired with the Zorga Mask here, so these get 10k from its skill, 10k from Persona Ride, 10k because you Alchemagic, it's +3, so these are 35k double crit beaters. So if you can get your opponent to 4 damage, it's really hard for them to take a hit because you've thrown critical triggers with your Vanguard, and then these are swinging for lethal as well. These are also great at pushing damage and just gives you so much additional value off of your orders. Like this, I don't foresee this card being cut from Zorga. It hasn't been. They'd really need to give you like a power creep card or something else to Zorga to get this card out of the deck because it is just so good. So 4 copies, you want to be finding your 2 copies in to set up in your Drop Zone, and multiple copies aren't too bad because then you're not as worried about having to reset them as well. Though if you're up against Gandiva, most of the time, like, you're easily getting these reset unless your opposing Gandiva player is really careful about not getting these retired as well, which is possible. So yeah, 4 copies always, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. For the grade 2s, I do run the 4 Shadow Cloak. This one in particular is my favorite. I know some people have been dropping this or cutting it down for the depth it welleth. I know Outer Orange in particular was doing that because I did watch her deck profile, but I still like the Shadow Cloak here because I think it just provides so much more utility than depth it welleth to this deck. As I say, this is my only grade 2, so I'm not running the Keel Severing at all in this deck. I just think it's a bit too clunky and makes the deck more inconsistent than it needs to be. I think the beatdown strategy is perfectly fine. So when it came down to comparing Shadow Cloak with depth it welleth, I just like the extra utility this card gets. This deck does not have problems looping orders back to hand, so getting to drop zone is a-okay. It's also deck thinning, and it's just more flexible. Depth of Welleth can get you cards to hand, so it's a +1 to hand, which is really strong. But it's specifically only masks, so once you go through all your masks, you're not looping back anything. Meanwhile, Shadow Cloak, as long as you still have orders in deck that aren't in drop zone, is still live and is not dependent on the mask at all. So it's just a great consistency card overall because it can find you your masks if you need it. But if you already have masks, you can find other stuff, get other really powerful alchemy magic going. And it's also our way to loop back stuff. So if we call, say, a Zorga Masques from drop zone to rear, or just have a Zorga Masques on rearguard circle, most of the time we'll be calling it from drop zone anyway. Or from deck, we actually do have an order that does that. Shadow Cloak, if it's on Alchemy Magic, can trigger to Soul Blast 1 to bounce it back to hand, and that is a great way to secure it. One for just Persona rides, but also for your mass turn as well if you still haven't found it yet. Great enabler, love seeing this card, and I love seeing it on turn 2 just to quickly thin out the deck to up my trigger odds and be aggressive with it, is how I like to use this card. Moving to the grade 1s, the first one I want to talk about is the 3 Burrow Mushroom here. This card is just amazing. Just being able to throw it to soul, you get an extra soul, which isn't the most important in this deck, but can sometimes come up. Sometimes you can burn through your soul pretty quickly. But more importantly, it spawns 2 plant tokens, which is great for so many reasons. This is a great way to round out a board to get some boosters for the roaming prison dragons to just hit it an extra 5k increment. This card is also great for early rush. If I see this in my opening hand, a lot of times I like to throw it down, throw it to soul, and just create a 10k column. On my grade 2 turn, I've also just thrown 1 behind Shadow Cloak and 1 behind the Black Tear's Husk Dragon, my Vanguard. It's great numbers, or just maybe like an extra 10k column depending on the game. So versatile, so good. Even to the Gandiva matchup, it's fine because it's not like you get to create 2 extra bodies off of this card. So it's not, it's a great kind of like throwing out fate units against Gandiva is how I like to look at it. It just lets me feel less bad because now they have to use 2 skills to get rid of it, or 2 retire effects to get rid of it instead of 1. And yeah, this card, you see it in so many Stoicheia decks. I feel like if you've seen other Stoicheia decks, it should be pretty self-explanatory. This one also has the extra benefit of being able to reset your roaming prison dragons if you need to by overcalling them with 2 plant tokens during your turn, which is really strong. So wish I could run a full 4 copies of this one, but I do need room in this deck for other stuff, and I think other stuff at 4 copies is more important, so 3 has been working out just fine for me. Next up for the grade 1s, 3 Bist Iotfist. So this is our main way to loop back orders and is our only use of Counterblast, actually, other than the Blue Zorga here. So you're actually really free to use your Counterblast for like Blue Zorga and then this one. So feel free creating the Dragon Tree Markers even without the Keel Severing. But mostly it's here because of its ability to loop back orders. Just gives you a lot of great extra utility to be able to parse your orders correctly. Can even help you, even if you don't have an order in drop zone but have a mask in your soul, you can just soul blast it out with this guy and loop it back to hand. Doesn't necessarily help you with Alchemy Magic if you don't have any other orders in drop zone, but it's a note there as well. So just great card for that one. Once I talk about the orders, I think this card will also make a lot more sense for the combos you can do with it. But I really want to find this one. So a lot of times once I find multiples, yeah, they're kind of dead cards in hand, but I want to find this card as soon as possible. So that's why I run it at 3 copies, because that utility is super important. Then, of course, just the 3-1 breakdown for the PGs, the 3 Planner Prevent, and the 1 Elementary Sanctitude, since this is not a grade 4 deck, and this still gets around some very relevant garbage tricks, or maybe the Rogue grade 4 deck as well. So that makes a lot of sense, and it's also fun with the Planner Prevent Dragon with the Shadow Cloak. If you don't need to loop back Persona rides, that's also a pretty good option to loop back on top of your Overtrigger, depending on the matchup, whether PGs or just large shield value is more relevant. For the triggers, I do run the 6 crit, 5 front, 4 heal, and then of course the 1 over trigger. So this one I did copy from Orange's list, and I actually am really liking the results I am seeing from testing. A lot of people don't really expect the 5 front or really are paying much attention to it from what I see. Of course, that's very dependent on who's in your local meta. I'm sure the more competitive players will make note of that as well, but still it's also fun when because you still got like enough crits here to pressure and make your opponent want to guard the Vanguard swing in fear of checking those crits. But a lot of times if you just check fronts instead, like they still guarded with it, and all of a sudden your roaming prison dragons, if they're swinging for lethal, just become even harder to guard with these fronts and just make bigger numbers. And this is just a big beatdown deck, and fronts do wonders for this deck. It's not like you're adjusting the shield value at all by running the 5th front here. Don't run any of the effect crits because my locals personally does not lean either way towards restanders or crit gainers or even grade 4 strategies. So the 15k just for consistency is what I like to do. Of course, the Stoicheia OT, you could run the Valnot or the Isfaro, so the red and blue OTs in this spot, but I think just the Omni trigger is so good. It still provides that crit, which I actually think is one of the most important aspects of this card as a 7 crit in the deck for the Vanguard swing, but it's just never bad. Like you're always at least drawing 2 cards off of it, so seeing 2 new cards. Extra crit, of course, is great. The extra 10k to the front row is super relevant for the same reason why I'm running more fronts. Like there's just never a bad time for this card, so I don't like replacing with the other ones because of that reason, and it fits in perfectly with the deck. I also do run the Soul and crits, not too relevant in this deck, the power nor the extra soul, but at the same time, if it ever is relevant, it's not like I'm losing out on any power because most of the time I'm either calling down to attack with a roaming prison dragon or a shadow cloak, or even looping out the Black Tears Husk Dragon from Soul, and those cards all, it doesn't matter if it's being boosted by a 4k or a 5k. The only card that would matter is your Zorga Masques, which I seldomly call out and attack. Most of the time I'm looping it back anyway, so this card's perfectly fine if needed. You can also just run the 5ks, like it really doesn't matter. I just kept these in here because they're already in here from previous versions. Now moving on to the orders. So first off, I do run the 1 Forbid All Surrogate, one of the new Regalis pieces here. This card is great to find the pieces, mainly the Zorga Masques and the Roaming Prison Dragons, to help me just set these up a bit quicker, and mainly like to loop back with the Shadow Cloak, as I explained. It's our main way to get it out of the deck. Thins 2 cards as well, and it also has the extra flexibility if I've gone through all my Zorga Masques and I still haven't used this, to instead loop 1 back from drop zone instead and still be able to bounce that. Just great overall, just phenomenal utility. Doesn't cost anything either. And yeah, usually when I use this, I like to use it on the first Alchemagic just to, again, start setting stuff up for future turns. But of course, it can be used later. Just you can only Alchemagic with this card once. Doesn't matter if it's on the front end or the back end because of that Regalis piece text. You can only use it once. So run 2 of the Mask of Hydrogum here, just so if one gets damaged, I still have access to 1 because I still need it to be able to do my mask plays. This one also is not bad at all to use as part of your Alchemagic because it's free. It can help you search out Persona Ride copies. I've definitely done that when no other orders are better, and can help find the Bist Iotvis as well and add it to hand. Not my favorite order to Alchemagic because it is a top 5 search and can easily whiff with only 6 targets in deck, but nonetheless, it's still an option, which is a-okay, and most of the time I just loop it to Soul anyway. Do have to be careful about when you Alchemagic this and how you are, because if you Alchemagic it from drop zone, it's bound because of how Alchemagic works, and you no longer have access to it to go into your mask plays. So a lot of times if you're using it, you either need to be fine with it being bound because you're not going to use a secondary effect, maybe you're already in the mask or you have a second one set up, or you just use it from hand, so do be careful about that. Next up, I run 2 Gather Upon Me, Ye Wandering Souls, just a great way to give a drive check and to thin the deck, the hand out of extra order cards. So sometimes the hand might be clogged up and it just gets you an extra drive check, meaning extra pressure, you're cycling through your deck a bit more. Really great. Just make sure that if you're using it, you're already in Zorga Masques. Or else you will lose the drive check when you go into it. So be careful about that one. It's also nice in the late game just to put out that extra pressure if need be. And of course, we can help easily get back orders with the Bist Iotvis plus Zorga skill to set up both the order card and the cost as well, which is really strong. This is also great on the second turn with the Black Tears Husk Dragon, but I would not recommend using that combo unless you have Roaming Prison Dragons in your drop that you're ready to use, and you do have the setup for another Alchemagic the following turn as well. Like if you only have access to this and say a Mask of Hydrogum, you don't really want to be using this one because then you won't have a set for Alchemagic next turn, since you need to discard an order card to even play it. And also the reason I say use it with the Roaming Prison Dragons is if you're using it, it's inherently a -2 from hand to go +1, so it's net -1. But if you have the Roaming Prison Dragons, you're calling out 2 attackers, you're getting that value that you want anyway. So there are definitely scenarios where it's phenomenal on turn 2, but it's not. There's scenarios where it's also not optimal at all, so do be cognizant of that. Next up, I run 1 Tearful Malice, a great way to reset the Roaming Prison Dragons if I have no other way to do it, and just a nice card to just draw a card, be able to put into Soul. The Soul doesn't really matter. Countercharge also doesn't really matter, so it's mostly there just as a great way to reset the Roaming Prison Dragons and just kind of cycle cards in hand if need be. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this card. Only one copy for those scenarios as well. Or honestly, if your opponent maybe counterblast denied you, you can also do that. And you can always, if you already have that in hand and you have a Abyss Office, you can always Alchemy Magic with this first, get the counter charge back for Abyss Office. Honestly, sets it up perfectly for Abyss Office, giving you the soul. So some utility in here, but again, only one copy because it's not always necessary. It's just there for the scenarios where it is needed. Then finally, 3 copies of the In the Dim Darkness. I think this is the most important order, not so much from a you need to be using this every single turn, but it's the most generically good one because it lets you check top 3, mill 1, so you're deck thinning. It's helping you find your pieces as well to set up in the drop zone, and calling stuff out is also super good. The only card you really don't want to be calling off of this is, of course, like your Roaming Prison Drives because you're calling off your own skill, and Shadow Cloak because Shadow Cloak will not meet its timing to bounce a card back. But it's great because you can Soul Blast out a Burrowing Mushroom, call it back, spawn 2 more units, call it Abyss Diopthus to be able to get access to its skill, call back a Zorga Masques to bounce to hand. You can also use this card to bounce back triggers, OT great, bounce it back if need be. So ton of great utility to help build out a board, kind of just enable a lot of these really cool value plays as well. And this card's just great for that. And even just using Alchemy Magicking too is great with it. But again, most of the time it's just because it's such a great card to Alchemy Magic with everything else that I want to run it at 3 copies, not necessarily that I need to be playing this every single turn. It's just generically good. This card deck is just a beat down deck, so I think it's best to show it in action. But one combo I did really want to discuss is the flexibility in being able to do your mask even if you don't have it. So let's just say you have a mask and drop zone, or even like a mask and drop zone. It could also be in hand, a Forbid All Surrogate, but for the sake of this example, let's also say that there is an In the Dim Darkness in hand. Just really any combination lets you Alchemy Magic with this card, and the only other card you need on board is a Shadow Cloak before you even use the orders, because what that means is you can Alchemy Magic with the In the Dim Darkness, or even for sake of simplicity, let's just say we're using that Mask of Hydrogrum. You can Alchemy Magic with Mask of Hydrogrum with the Forbid All Surrogate, so we bind that card, and what you get is a top 5 search to try to find your Zorga Masques, and this will set the order and drop. And even if you don't find it, or maybe you find that in Abyss Diopthus, you might be able to prioritize Abyss Diopthus, and that way instead you can use Forbid All Surrogate to call out the Persona Ride, usually behind Vanguard, and say a Roaming Prison Dragon to set up, and now you can easily bounce it back. So even if you whiff on this, you've got the insurance, and maybe you hit on both of these. You find 2 Zorga Masques, now you have 1 to ride this turn, and now you have your follow-up Persona Ride copy. So really strong here. You can do it on your first turn, and it's just a great way, again, to enable only 3 copies of the Zorga Masques and still be able to easily find it. And now I would like to go through some mulligans and just kind of early game general game flow, just to kind of show off what this deck is capable of. So of course, ideally going second, drawing the hand, and here we found an order. That's huge. Usually other things we want here are the Shadow Cloak or a Mask of Hydrogrum with a Zorga as well, just to be able to set up our Persona Ride as well. Abyss Diopthus is nice, but I usually do not like to keep it because it's better in the later game to loop back orders than in the early game. So I think I'll mulligan 4, hoping to find a Shadow Cloak, Zorga Masque, and Mask of Hydrogrum, because they are just better and more what I need in the early game. Oh, and Roaming Prison Dragon to be able to discard a setup. So here, find the Zorga Masques. Abyss Diopthus is fine, and 2 of Gather Upon You Wandering Souls. Not the best opening hand, but there is still stuff that can happen with this deck, with this hand, and getting the extra drive, possibly setting up on turn 2 just to kind of filter, is still an option even without the Roaming Prison Dragon. It's not ideal, but we might just need to do that to be able to see more cards and cycle through them more. All right, so let's draw for turn. Ooh, Roaming Prison Dragon, perfect. So I usually like to set this up, so just discard it for Ride Line, real easy. Ride the Raker Chain, get the draw 1, which is a Shadow Cloak, even better. So see, just all these draws, finding us our pieces, even though we had a lackluster hand. And then of course we can use the Raker Chain skill to draw 2 more. 2 triggers, okay, luck had to end up somewhere and we haven't seen any triggers. Not great, but that is fine, but we can also just easily discard an order, and Tearful Mouse gives away the least number of information. It's probably the least useful order, so we can just get rid of that. No Burrowing Mushrooms for some aggression, so we just can swing with Vanguard and see our 5th card, another Roaming Prison Dragon. All right, so going over to the opponent's turn, we do have the option to guard early, and this deck doesn't really use too much Counterblast and doesn't need the Dragon Tree markers, so a lot of the times I do think it is correct to guard early, but again, that is a bit matchup dependent, so let's just say we throw out a 15k shield to guard early, pass it back over, can stand and draw, and Burrowing Mushrooms is very good here. So in terms of discard, we can discard a Roaming Prison Dragon to set it up. We also have other options here, but in terms of like shield value as well, I think shield value, keeping shield value is the most important here. I do think the Roaming Prison Dragon is correct, even if we don't end up calling it. So I can go into Black Tear's Husk Dragon, its skill loops back in order, so I can grab back the Tearful Malice. And here we actually have a really strong turn 2 setup. We got the Burrowing Mushrooms, we got the Shadow Cloak, we got 2 Roaming Prison Dragons and drop. And here, I actually don't even think we need to call both Roaming Prison Dragons. Let's just kind of keep one in drop zone as well. It is 5k extra power, so I think you can make a debate for that one. But again, it's just kind of matchup dependent. Play it out. This is actually an interesting scenario that there's more variables here for the opponent that would make my decision. But of course, I think to start out with, just go the Shadow Cloak to send it in order. Don't have Mask of Hydrogrum yet, so I think that is the correct one to send off of this, just to set it up for next turn. And we'll shuffle up, and then we will proceed, because I do think that this is a Gather Upon Me Wandering Souls turn. I actually thought about it a bit more, and with double Roaming Prison Dragon and the ability to have a Tearful Malice online, I do actually think it's correct to call a Shadow Cloak back here and call both of them, because we do have a way to reset them. So we'll use the Gather Upon Me You Wandering Souls and discard. There's no correct discard, but they know the Tearful Malice, so let's just discard that one since the opponent already knows about it. Give the Vanguard Drive +1. We got 2 Roaming Prison Dragons that trigger. We get to call them out. Correct thing here is just to give it the 10k, because you're just trying to get the opponent to 4 damage and try to force out any guard you can. And now you also have the option to call down the Burrowing Mushrooms and throw 2 to Soul. You can always call the Bistai, but at the same time, its skill isn't live, so say against Gandiva, probably not the best to call it down now. So we'll just do the Burrowing Mushrooms, throw it to Soul, and get ourselves 2 plant tokens. So now we've got a 15k, 15k, 20k column, which is really strong. And since this deck does run fronts, we swing Vanguard first, and we get the Twin Drive here. Forbid All Surrogate, that's a nice order to see as well. Help find more Persona Rising Roaming Prison Dragons in the deck, and Burrow Mushrooms is not too bad. So now we have a second way to reset those. 15k, 20k hits over trigger notably, and yeah, that's a really strong turn too. So of course, since we go second, normally the opponent's at their grade 3 turn, so let's just say we take Vanguard swing, front trigger's not too bad. Let's say we take another one. Zorga Masques, don't love to see that. And we do have a 15k shield that we can use pretty easily. And here, depending on the Vanguard size, like numbers matter here, you can always drop the 5k. We can easily get back this Burrow Mushrooms if we want to stay at 2, or you can take the 3, or maybe it's just a 3 attack deck anyway. But for the sake of this, let's just say we get rid of the Burrowing Mushrooms as well. Highly dependent there, but just kind of give you an idea of the snares that can happen. Going back to your turn, let's just say we're not against Gandiva and retire, so we still have our board. Draw 1, front trigger, not great, but what we can do here is we got plenty of options. We got Bistai to start looping stuff back, but we also have our Vanguard's ability to Counterblast 1 to loop something back. So it's a question of, do we want to get the value? Do we want to get a Dragon Tree marker? And most likely we want to loop back in order. Do we even want to use the Gather Upon Me? So we got plenty of options here to consider. Here I think is actually a perfect turn to kind of experiment and see the different outcomes against the different decks. But I think a good option here would be to discard Forbid All Surrogate from hand to ride into the Zorga. We don't really need the value on board, so a nice thing we could do is summon the Bist Iotvis. We get rid of that token, use Bist Iotvis skill to generate a Dragon Tree marker just to get some extra power, because, well, we don't need the Counterblast, we don't need the value off of Zorga. And then what we can do is actually use Bist Iotvis' skill here to Counterblast 1. We can Soul Blast, we have a Burning Mushrooms and drop, so maybe a Rancor Chain to be able to summon behind the Vanguard won't be too bad, to loop back to hand the Tearful Malice. So here, you also could have made the argument to discard the other Gather Upon Me and keep the Tearful Malice in hand. That way, you didn't have to loop it back preemptively, but at the same time, that was also knowledge that you don't have. So this is where the deck gets complicated. You really need to test to see what is optimal, because there's so many different lines and what's relevant. It's very dependent. But here, now we've got the masks set up, and I see well, let's see. It depends if you want to use the Gather Upon You Wandering Soul, but the line I think I want to do is do Tearful Malice to reset the Roaming Prison Dragons with Forbid All Surrogate to find another copy of Persona Ride and then the deck of 2. And the question here is, do I want to draw first? Not really. I think I would rather increase my chance to find PGs and some other pieces. So I do think I will Alchemagic here first. Since I'm not using the Gather Upon You Wandering Souls, I'm free to do that to retire these 2. And Alchemagicing with the Forbid All Surrogate to find it. And now, pay the cost, I draw 1, and it's a PG, and that's what I'm looking for. Tearful Malice goes to Soul, and I countercharge 1. So I also still have the option to Zorga here with this scenario. Then, Forbid All Surrogate lets me check my deck in drop zone. I still have cards in deck, so I want to see them. Call it a Roaming Prison Dragon. And the final FFR, Zorga Masques, loop it back. And with this information, the opponent doesn't actually know if I will have another Persona Ride yet, because I don't think with those drive checks that I revealed a Zorga Mask. I believe it was in the opening hand. So this also is a great way to protect information by doing it in this order. So all Alchemagic orders resolved. Now I've got the skill of the Roaming Prison Dragon. I'll Soul Blast, let's just say the order to keep those in the loop, bounce back the Zorga Masques, and then I do get my 2 Roaming Prison Dragon triggers from Drop Zone to call them both out, give them 10k, give them +1 critical, that one resets, and boom, we got a very powerful board here. So of course now we have the option to use Zorga's ability before going into the mask. One option would be to call the Burrow Mushrooms over the token. Sure, it isn't great value, but now you have a card you can throw to Soul to reset the Roaming Prison Dragons next turn, but at the same time, do have a 3rd Roaming Prison Dragon in drop. I've got the Tearful Malice as well, so I don't think that is super necessary. Could always also just try to make bigger numbers with a Ranker Chain behind Vanguard. That one's not bad either. And the real question is, do I really think I need the Counterblast or anything else, or just want to get the value now? I think the value now is fine. Really, this deck does not have a problem with Counterblast. At 2 damage, definitely taking some, so we can just overcall the plant token. You can always overcall the Shadow Cloak, and in a retire matchup, that might be the correct play. Instead, call over the Shadow Cloak to make this column even bigger, but if you're not against a retire matchup, then it might be great just to keep the Shadow Cloak back here for some value. So of course, now we want to put on the masks. We got Mask of Hydrogum from here, revealing that FFR Zorga Mask to hide that information to Persona Ride. Get that draw, and it's a heal trigger. And at this stage, we had such an aggressive turn 2 that I don't think that we're checking that one anyway. So of course, we swing first with the Zorga. This one is for 33 on zone, 43 plus the Ranker Chain, Twin Drive. Let's see what we get. Crit trigger, awesome, putting on some pressure, and another crit trigger. So even if the opponent was not at 4 damage yet, we can just kind of put more pressure on here. Vanguard can also hit for a ton. And we just kind of keep, oh, not Shadow Cloak, swinging here and swinging here. And now for next turn, we can easily take some damage. So let's just say over trigger, well, that would just shut down the turn. Now at the same time, over trigger would just, yeah, shut down the turn. We got PGs, we got Persona Ride follow up for like, what would our draw be? That. And so here, this is, oh, nope, this is not an unfortunate scenario because we actually have Zorga in Soul is the great way to keep it. So now even without damage, we can always loop back in order. So we have the Gather Upon Me Wandering Souls online with the Mask of Hydrogum and whatnot. So I really do like this upgrade for Zorga. Mask was, I think, a great thing for Zorga to have, just being able to lean more into that beatdown strategy. I know that the 4th attack is really cool with Kill Severing, but again, I do think that just adds a layer of inconsistency. And every time I saw Kill Severing, especially in my opening hand or early on, I wish it was pretty much any other combo or any other requirement piece in the deck except itself. Hence why I cut it, but of course you can always find room for it in your own deck if you do want to run it, because there are some flex spots as well. You can also always cut like a Tearful Malice and run other ways to reset your Roaming Prison Dragons. That's another option as well if you really care about that. Kill Severing can also do that. If you didn't know, you can retire 1 Roaming Prison Dragon that isn't on the Dragon Tree marker, the Kill Severing, and overcall it on the one that is on the Dragon Tree marker as well. So that is another option if you want to mix up the deck, but that's kind of my take on it. This deck is not the most consistent. It's got a really hype output, and if everything goes right for you, or even most things go right with you, you can definitely just steamroll your opponent with this deck with the large numbers, the crit pressure. It's really strong, but the issue is there's so many pieces you need to find. You need to find your masks. This is no longer in order, but you need to find your orders. You need to find your Persona Ride, your Zorga Mask. You need to find your Mask of Hydrogrums to set up. You need to find your Roaming Prison Dragons to set up to be able to do that. It's really hard to do that, so there will definitely be games where you just brick, and there's no other way around that. And also, as you can see, this deck is very complicated. So even when everything's going right, just seeing the lines, seeing the correct play to make sure that you can keep going turn after turn, make sure you're setting up everything and finding everything. It's complicated. So this is a hard deck to truly master. I don't even think I've truly mastered it, but it is a blast to play, and that is my take on it. But I want to hear from you all. How do your lists differ from my list, and why did you have those changes? I love that conversation down in the comments below because I feel like it makes us all better deck builders. And if you'd like to see some games with Zorga Masques, just let me know. I can definitely film a video and put it up just so you can see the kind of general game flow. Can't promise that it will be 100% great, but I feel like there will be a lot of great discussion on the plays you can make and what the correct plays are. I mean, you even see it in my kind of quick demo that probably not quick, but that demo I gave as well. So yeah, let me know down in the comments below. And if you're excited for more Vanguard content coming out from me, please consider subscribing and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload that content. But that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.